Good afternoon and good evening, and welcome to the Center for Strategic and International Studies. My name is Michelle Struck, and I am the Khosravi Chair in Principled Internationalism and the Director of our Human Rights Initiative and our Humanitarian Agenda. It is my pleasure to be with you today to have this distinguished panel who will be discussing a topic of consult and cooperate in times of great need, Indigenous rights and just transition. Here in the studio with me today, I have the pleasure of being joined by Vanessa Jimenez, who oversees the Kawari Fund, which is a source of finance to Indigenous peoples and local communities who are seeking to advance their rights in the context of jurisdictional forest carbon finance initiatives. And for over 25 years, Vanessa has worked for governments, public institutions, the private sector, nonprofits, and philanthropy. She focuses on the nexus between self-determination, human rights, environmental protection, and climate finance. Also in the room here today, we have the pleasure of being joined by Ambassador Keith Harper. Keith is the former U.S. Ambassador and permanent representative to the UN Human Rights Council in Geneva, Switzerland. He is a citizen of the Cherokee Nation and was the first Native American to be named a U.S. Ambassador. His distinguished career saw him serving as a commissioner on the President's Commission on White House Fellowships and in key leadership positions, including the head of the D.C. office of the Office of Native American Rights Fund from 1995 to 2006, and he is currently a partner at Jenner & Block in Washington, D.C. Joining us from Geneva is Martin Oles, who is a senior specialist on equality and non-discrimination and a team leader in the Gender Equality, Diversity, and Inclusion branch at the ILO's Conditions of Work and Equality Department. Since joining ILO in 2001, he's held various positions related to the supervision and promotion of international labor standards with a focus on equality and non-discrimination and conditions of work. And he serves as the ILO's global focal point for Indigenous and tribal peoples issues and coordinates the ILO strategy of action on the topic. In addition to other positions prior to joining the ILO, he worked as a human rights advisor for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Austria. So it is my absolute delight to be here to discuss such an important and timely topic. As we contend with, in the US and around the world, the national security and clean energy implications of a just transition, it is imperative that communities are not left behind who have important rights that are at stake when critical minerals and other elements are being discussed as part of that energy future. So it is important to have a discussion on the consultation and cooperation of Indigenous people who hold important rights over their resources, lands, and culture, and how this relates to the just transition. So without further ado, we will get into the discussion today, and I thank you again for joining CSIS here for this event. So I'll start with you, Ambassador Keith Harper. What does current consultation and cooperation from your perspective with Indigenous groups look like in the context of mining and critical mineral extraction? And it'd be really wonderful to hear, if you think it should change, and if so, how?
Sure. Well, first, thank you for having me here. I think that the starting place, whenever we're talking about Indigenous peoples, should be the Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, because that document, negotiated over 3 decades, is the agreement among member states and Indigenous peoples about what the rules of the road are. How do we ensure the protection? What are the rights, and how do we ensure the protection of those rights? And there are 2 concepts that I think are most salient here for this discussion. The first one is, and I think it's named 7 or 8 times in the Declaration, is the idea of free, prior, and informed consent, what's called, commonly referred to as FPIC. This concept that in their lived experiences, Indigenous peoples understand that many of the problems arise when they have not been properly consulted, as your question alludes to. And it's not only consultation, but it is consent, that if you are utilizing the resources, it's going to have an impact on the territories of the people of a community, they should give free, prior, and informed consent. And when I speak with Indigenous communities, whether here in the United States or elsewhere, they're not anti-development, and especially when we're moving towards the greening of the economy, they understand the climate imperative. They want to be part of the solution, but they want to do it in a way that they are consenting to the use of their territories and their lands. The other principle that's really important to bear in mind is that the Declaration requires that we include Indigenous peoples in the development so that they can get the benefits of their resources. Again, too often in the past, member states failed to ensure that the indigenous communities themselves, the indigenous peoples themselves, gain the benefits. So those are the two most salient principles as we have this discussion. I think that the short answer is that it depends where and how. And in some places, states are doing a good job. In other places, they're not doing such a good job. I think over the years, the United States, for example, has gotten far better in its consultation with indigenous peoples. Not that it has done so every time. You know, I think part of the challenge that we saw in North Dakota with the Dakota Access Pipeline is a failure to get consent from the communities that were going to be impacted by that pipeline. And certainly when we're talking about, mineral extraction, things like lithium, those things do have a major impact on the environment of these communities. And so we have to build best practices to ensure that they're brought into their conversation and that they do give their free, prior, and informed consent. I see that states are struggling with this because they see the imperative of utilizing these minerals. And they want to have shortcuts. But there just aren't shortcuts when you're talking about these kinds of processes. That's the whole point of these kinds of processes. Mapuche Indians in Chile should be signing off on the use of their lands when extracting these minerals, and so too should indigenous peoples around the world. And if you engage them effectively, I think you'll find out more often than not that they do want to participate in this greening of the economy, like other communities do.
Thank you so much, and thank you for underscoring free, prior, and informed consent and the imperative for people to have benefit from these, especially because so much of this extraction and use of indigenous lands ends up being permanent. And so it's something that that consent, I can imagine, is such an important element. So thank you for sharing that. One question for you, based on your former role as U.S. Ambassador to the Human Rights Council, what role do you think international organizations can or should play in the process of consultation? Should they be helping to facilitate consultation? What are helpful ways that international institutions can be part of this?
I think there are critical ways that multilateral institutions in particular can be helpful. One important output is that entities like the Expert Mechanism on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and they have done this, analyze what does a process that ensures free, prior, informed consent look like. You know, what do you have to do? Not sort of in general terms, but very specific, granular terms. What is that engagement? What should that engagement look like? What should you be considering? You know, one thing that isn't obvious is that sometimes there are certain individuals that are considered leaders in a community, and sometimes there are other leaders. Well, who is the leader? Who's actually speaking? Who has the constituency that is speaking for the particular community? And different nations, different member states have different processes for making that determination. Well, I think that when we look at these institutions like the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Peoples or the Special Rapporteur on Indigenous Peoples or the MRIP, these are institutions that do a lot of thinking about how do you develop processes that make sense. And I think that part of the job of the United Nations in particular and other multilateral institutions is to get the word out on what those mean and to have some type of due diligence with states to ensure that those practices are being followed.
Thank you for that. And so I'll turn to Martin in Geneva at the International Labour Organization. I know that the International Labour Organization is designing mechanisms, including the upcoming consultation in Brazil, to ensure that consultation and cooperation occurs according to best practice and in the proper way. Could you tell us a little bit more about how the ILO is thinking about those and building on its experience with indigenous labor rights?
Well, thank you so much also for this fascinating conversation, and I'm really pleased to be here because, as the ambassador said, I think international organizations can play a role in facilitating that. In particular, the expert mechanisms. No, this is different than the administration, the secretariats. These are the experts that are providing also that advice, and in particular, indigenous experts. At the same time, we are also seeing that there is an important role for the state, and here in particular governments, to build up their own institutions. And I think this is a little bit the role that the ILO is playing, in particular in countries that have ratified a convention that was adopted in the ILO in 1989, the Indigenous and Tribal Peoples Convention, number 169, that has, a lot of things that are very relevant to building up that national infrastructure of institutions, mechanisms, and procedures through which consultation and cooperation can take place, including with a view to obtaining that consent that is so much necessary when these projects affect the rights and livelihoods of indigenous and tribal communities around the world. So there is a big gap there when it comes to that, and there is a lot of responsibility with the government, but also by other actors. In the ILO, we are a tripartite organization where governments, workers, and the private sector come together. So how these groups can also contribute to national discussions to facilitate the adoption of the necessary laws and institutions. And there is a lot of confidence building and capacity building to be done. It's not easy, but there is a minimum of requirement of institutions that you need. So we have held a number of regional but also national meetings to bring together these actors to start building a dialogue, to build a trust there. So, and I think that we have to catch up on a lot. There are a lot of gaps, and these gaps are filling these gaps and addressing these gaps becomes now more urgent also in the context of climate change and the need to achieve a just transition. But a transition can be just if it's just for all the actors involved. And I think indigenous peoples have a lot to say in this regard. And so we are promoting this dialogue in Brazil, in Belém, actually. This is also the place where the next COP after Baku will take place. This will be an opportunity to highlight the need, the contribution of indigenous peoples, and the need to build up and to invest more in these mechanisms that we need now. So this is a bit in a nutshell what we are trying to come up with, and we look forward also to sharing the results of this dialogue that we are holding in Belém in Brazil this December.
Thank you, and thank you to the ILO for the efforts to include Indigenous people in this and to develop this mechanism. I'm excited to hear what comes of it. I'll turn to Vanessa. In terms of, we've talked about the need for consent, the need for appropriate consultation and cooperation mechanisms. Your organization aims to ensure participation of Indigenous groups in carbon markets, and that's slightly different than in the extractive process. But what are some of the trends that you've seen in the involvement of these groups, and how should stakeholders be looking at how to do these types of consultations? Obviously, it's not new, and what are you seeing in that regard?
Sure. Thank you for inviting me, and thank you for the wonderful words of my co-panelists here. So much to be engaged in, but as I was preparing for this, I was thinking so much about how different are carbon markets from extractive industries. Obviously, we know that there is a significant difference, but there's actually much that is the same as well, in the extent of if you look at the fact that 35% of forests are basically stewarded by indigenous peoples, and some would calculate that up to about 50% of critical minerals are found in indigenous lands, right? And so I think that we know that what's going to happen is we're going to have robust, good faith consultations and discussions about who owns that asset and how is it going to be disposed of and who's going to benefit from that and what are the risks and what are the opportunities. And in that context, we're going to have to ask questions about who owns a forest, who owns the land beneath, who owns the carbon that's captured, right? Next thing we'll be talking about the sunlight that's captured in a solar panel, right? And then we're going to be talking about issues of surface and subsurface rights. And then inevitably, as we talk about those rights, we need to do these in active engagement and consultations, and without a doubt, free, prior, informed consent. And I agree with the ambassador that the UNDRIP is a great a great resource, because it is not just some non-binding declaration. It is, in fact, encompasses really all that has been said about Indigenous peoples' rights already in international treaties that are binding on so many states. And so it's just such a great, it's like your quick guide to some of the most important rights of Indigenous peoples. So I truly advocate that people look at that. And if you have questions, yes, all of these multilateral institutions and all of the human rights committees that interpret these various treaties that have been reached and agreed to by the supermajority, if not all states, you can find wonderful guidance there. I think also in the carbon markets, just as you will with many of the other energy transition activities, you're going to encounter distrust because of historic engagements with Indigenous peoples. That needs to be overcome in a consultation, especially with transparency, especially with ensuring that you engage with representative institutions of the Indigenous peoples selected by them, not by the government. It also in the context of carbon markets, we also see that there has been some advances or new emerging standards that I think are just advancing in general and increasing or putting the bar up higher in terms of social and environmental standards, even as a matter of ensuring that we're not in the context of climate programs and in energy transition activities, we're not just focusing on environmental impacts, but in fact those social impacts. And that's what we mean by a high integrity carbon market. You can argue kind of the high integrity of any energy transition. It's social and environmental impacts, and it's not just the calculation of a ton of carbon or a barrel of oil or whatever it might be, right? So I think that's important. I think also what we're facing, because I think now in this global world where all of these nations, both global north has taken quite a lead in it, and global south as well is developing like their agreed industrial policies and their futures for economic recovery. They're developing large policies and programs in the context of carbon. Probably the predecessor there was our RED Plus, to reduce emissions through deforestation and caused by deforestation and degradation. What we saw is that countries learned a lot about opening up space to stakeholders to join those discussions, to develop these broad programs to talk about their natural resources and how they're going to be used. What we're now seeing, though, sometimes is that then when you drill it down to implementation of specific projects within those larger programs, sometimes countries think, well, we've already done that. We've already gotten the consent. But that's not quite the way it is, right? And I bring this up because while in the carbon market, you might talk a little bit about all the preparatory phases for these RED programs, those even that program formed the cornerstone to a lot of the green industrial policies that we're going to be seeing and other kind of economic plans to reduce poverty and address climate obligations. And we need to remember that broad consultation with Indigenous peoples is not the same as getting free, prior, informed consent from Indigenous peoples and communities at the local level when specific projects and activities of those just energy programs meet them on the ground. In that case, you're going to have to do FPIC. And despite all of this, I would close by saying, despite all of this, what we're observing is that in the context of climate finance and energy transitions, whatever project or program we're looking for, the budget for financing consultations, building capacity within Indigenous peoples and governments, and generally leading to more successful programs is really, really small. So we need to increase the financing that goes to Indigenous peoples to participate effectively in these programs, and especially to participate not in the case of just do no harm to them, like subjects of potential future harms we need to avoid, but also as equitable beneficiaries, partners, and very much like leaders, because they are leaders in their own territories, especially in conservation, and they could be leading programs and initiatives. And that is what the Kawari Fund was set up to do, to support these. And we hope to leverage, obviously, a great deal of support from other donors and others who are interested in the same things that we are.
Well, thank you, and thank you for these such important points on budgeting for consultation, having meaningful consultation, making it specific to each project, finding the right level. I see so many parallels to the work I did in country ownership over local development initiatives, where it can't be just a national level that then speaks for everyone. And this is even more important given the incredible and devastating history of Indigenous peoples and their lands. I would love to bring Ambassador Harper in too on this idea of it being specific and building trust with communities. To hear, how you think of what the gulf is between what is happening now, even in the maybe best practices that you've seen,
Sure.
and then that future that Vanessa talked about and that you talked about being embodied in the Declaration about there being equitable beneficiaries of a just transition and of these projects, leaders in their territories, this idea of thriving and not it being a checkbox. So
Right.
I know the gulf is large, but if you could speak to sort of maybe the trust elements and also where you see that right now, that gulf.
Sure. It's very interesting because in the United States, because we have 50 states, it is experimental, right? You can see how certain things work in certain places and how they don't work in other places. And one key element of that I've noticed, whether it's federal tribal cooperation or state tribal cooperation, it is very important that you collaborate when there is not a crisis. Too often, when there's a dispute, then two sovereigns get together and figure out the dispute. But that's not a healthy model because then you're always working with one another at this sort of high stakes level. And where you see these relationships develop and blossom are places like Washington State that used to have bitter fights about things like fishing rights in the Pacific Northwest. And then over time, the state and the tribes in the area really developed a cooperative model where they manage the fisheries together, for example. They deal with economic development together. They deal with roads together. They deal with virtually everything together. Not that they don't have disputes. They still do have disputes. But when you're able to work hand in glove with two sovereigns, what happens over time is that you build trust and benefit of the doubt. And so when they are consulting, you're not seeing that as simply a box checking exercise. You think that, yes, this is actually meaningfully going to impact whatever the decision making is. And that's what you have to get to. So when I look around and I see the things that work and the things that don't work throughout the globe when dealing with Indigenous peoples, it really comes down to this relationship building. Because the relationship is what allows you to have this spirit of cooperation and spirit of trust. And I want to agree with Martin. I think one of the things the ILO has done very well over the many years is a sort of multi-stakeholder approach where they bring various entities together with different interests, and yet they are able to facilitate a conversation, sometimes very challenging, difficult conversations. But over time, you see how that trust is that trust is built. Unfortunately, within member states, in domestic settings, sometimes one bad leader, unfortunately, can sort of undermine that trust for a considerable amount of time, and then it has to be rebuilt. And we've seen that. We've seen that certainly here in the United States, certainly in Brazil, in many places where indigenous communities and governments built that trust. So I think rather than sort of think about this as tackling the issue of consultation, we have to think about this as an issue of how do we build the relationships between various sovereigns, various entities, so that when they're addressing problems, they're doing it in a spirit of cooperation.
I really appreciate that because I think it also, when you take it out of the mechanism approach or something technical and you think about the shared outcomes that you want to experience, I know that can often, even in labor, be a really effective way to get to agreement. Maybe, Martin, maybe you could talk a little bit about the ILO's tripartite experience and how you see that influencing having these, even how you're thinking about developing these and getting to those shared interests amongst stakeholders.
Yeah, thanks so much for that. I think, the ILO is a tripartite organization. We have, we promote a culture of social dialogue. I mean, here we're basically talking about governments, workers, and employers. I mean, this is not exactly the same than a cooperation between a state with indigenous peoples, or as Ambassador said, between two sovereigns, which in many cases this is the case. So but I think we can draw a lot of lessons from, when people with legitimate interests, with a representation, that they someone can speak for this interest in a legitimate manner. Then you have that where you can establish that sort of a dialogue, and I think we can draw on that, and so. Of course, we also have to be careful, when we have this consultation, not, it's about indigenous people's rights, so indigenous peoples are the rights holder in that sense, but we need everybody on board. And I think we have seen that, in countries where our convention is ratified, it has been the mining sector and the mining industry and the mining ministries that have been most interested in getting these procedures in place, because for them it's a risk, a legal risk, it's a reputational risk if this is not happening, and governments haven't been so proactive. And I think we have to see both the project-related consultations and the broader relations across all issues, education, employment in the community. There is a lot to do that needs to be done. And so I think this broader consultation when regional and local and national development plans and strategies are discussed, that indigenous peoples can also be consulted on that. And that also there is a support that they build their own institutions. This cannot be, a private affair for indigenous communities and indigenous peoples. As a matter of fact, our convention even, says that the state needs to make available appropriate resources to have indigenous peoples maintain and develop their own institutions. So I think there is some very critical elements there, and this becomes even now more important where we talk about the just transition, critical minerals, and where we see this exponential growth in demand for certain critical minerals. That also means that indigenous peoples need to sort of participate in the benefits, because they are, as you said rightly, that they have rights to land, to natural resources, even though the legal systems vary quite a bit across, and the clarification and the better protection under the law of customary rights is also very important in this regard, because the frameworks are quite rudimentary in some countries, and there is conflicting pieces of legislation when it comes to indigenous peoples' land rights. So there is a lot to do also on that front, and we're also working in that direction. But I think wanted to just go back to that issue. Also, indigenous peoples are seen sometimes as rights holder in an abstract way, but indigenous communities and indigenous peoples individually and collectively are also economic actors. So the issue of supporting indigenous peoples' economies is a very important one, and we see indigenous peoples being active in many economic spheres, including in mining, including in energy. So I think that there is also the potential there, that indigenous peoples and communities as economic actors contribute actually to national climate goals through their sustainable activities. So I think that is something that has not been leveraged fully. And we see how the discussions at the international level go, but maybe the forthcoming discussions in Baku and then in Brazil, will help us to highlight that particular contribution that indigenous peoples can make and do make in many cases, and the collaboration that's needed in order to support them in that role.
Well, thank you. Would either of you like to jump in on those points, specifically on the economic contributions or the need to frame it in that manner? Is it useful to frame it in that manner in these discussions as well, to talk about the important and essential contributions that Indigenous people are making to just transition beyond being rights holders? Just curious if either of you wanted to jump in.
I mean, I could just say one little thing, and then no, there's certainly that component. And I hate to always bring it back to the U.S., but that's just what I happen to know best. One of the things the Biden administration enacted, or Congress enacted, but Biden administration pursued, was a establishment of a $20 billion loan program loan guarantee program within the Department of Energy for essentially renewable energy development for tribes. This is specifically for tribes. There's another loan program that's more general, but this $20 billion is set aside for tribes. Because, again, there are many instances when tribes want to be they do want to be the economic actor. They do want to utilize their land in that way. So long as they're the drivers of that, they're okay with it. Now, they may not be okay with other kinds of development. There was a case in Oklahoma with the Osage that was litigated regarding wind turbines, where the company did not get the consents that they needed to get for the use of the lands. So my point is this: I think we do need to see Indigenous peoples as economic actors. And ones that, this is critical, have been left out of prior developments, right?
Yeah.
I mean, one of the reasons you have the economic conditions that you have among a lot of Indigenous peoples is that you've had these waves of different types of emergent economies, from industrialization to the information age, all these things, and they basically have been left out of that. And so I think we do need to think of specific ways about how to include them in the greening economy. And this loan program is one aspect of it. I know that many tribes are interested in it. And what it's doing is it's having those tribes oftentimes partner with developers, and they're building up institutional capacity, the tribes are. The developers are building up understandings of tribal communities, and they're putting in place projects from solar to storage to wind development to hydrogen in numerous places around the country. So to me, that's an example of how this can get done, but it does take, I think, affirmative steps from central governments. Working with regional governments oftentimes to put in place these practices that can lead to kind of this virtuous cycle.
I really appreciate that, and thank you for bringing up as well the important points about people being historically left behind. Reading a series of principles that I know some Indigenous groups put out on just transition, a lot of that language is around how they view their lands traditionally, how important that consent is, and how the fact that many of those lands are ones that they did not give consent to being taken, and they're still calling for those to be given back. So I think these elements are really important to bring up, and the economic element, thank you for sharing that, is really important to see steps that are being taken. Vanessa, did you want to add anything from your experience? I think one interesting thing to hear about could be, the role, I know you did work in the past specifically on the Accountability Framework Initiative for Sustainable Supply Chains. So thinking about how when businesses are coming into this and they're thinking about Indigenous actors and consultation, how they are thinking about the kind of big process of due diligence and supply chains, and the important roles that Indigenous people and consultation play in those.
Sure. I think, as I said earlier, it's important that we deem important the consultations and therefore provide Indigenous peoples with the resources, I'm talking about financial and technical support, to engage. You gather just 10 adults walking down the street in front of your building. They don't understand carbon markets. Indigenous peoples are trying to understand. I think many of us maybe understand extractives more than we understand carbon markets. So let's first just talk, we need to just talk about capacity. That has nothing to do with someone being Indigenous or not. It's just one needs technical capacity to understand some of these economic efforts, and there should be time allotted for that. They're also why we're providing that support both to Indigenous peoples and I would say the governments and private actors who have to engage them, including in improving how they see consultations. I'd also like to use this time to dispel the notion that the idea of consultation and free prior informed consent is something entirely new, right? Governments and private sector, as part of their due diligence in multiple investments that they do in a year, or bilateral treaties, or border agreements, or when they need a concession from another country or a route of passage, whatever it might be, right? Companies who are going to engage, whether that's in extractives or in a carbon market, they have teams that invest time and money to do due diligence. And when they're interacting with another party, whether that's another government, another company, they research them. They ask them questions. How do you make your decisions? Who has the authority to negotiate versus who has the authority to make a decision? What are your cultural, in this area that we may be working, are there sacred sites? Is there a cultural element that we need to be aware of? And they say, who are you bringing to the next meeting? Oh, it's not your decision maker? Then our decision maker will stay back and we'll just bring the technical people. These are not foreign concepts. So often when I hear people say we need a FPIC guideline, or we need, this consultation is just too complex, actually you're just saying it might be hard, but it's not actually so complex or so foreign, so alien to what you are already doing. So I think it's important that while we support all of these actors, and that includes government and private sectors, to understand the importance of this engagement, because as you said, it's not a checkbox, it's not a one-time thing, it's going to be iterative, it's going to be about building a relationship, and it's not something you could just jump over. It's something you have to go through for the success of your project, right? As well as inclusive societies, and making sure that when we talk about development and poverty reduction and everybody being lifted up at the same time, we need to include Indigenous peoples. So I would just like to put that out there, sort of as well.
I really appreciate that. And I was hoping, Ambassador Harper, you might, with your current work, I know you work with companies on these kinds of issues, environmental, social, and governance issues, and, understanding that we certainly believe that good ESG practices and policies lead to long-term stability and collaboration between local populations and companies pursuing long-term efforts like critical minerals extraction. So in your view, how do you work with companies to ensure these relationships are respectful and fruitful, mutually beneficial, and are not reinventing the wheel? They're using their long, hard-won expertise and consultation to make sure this happens.
Yeah, look, it's interesting because I think one of the things that I think companies can do that really is helpful is to come to the table without making a bunch of decisions beforehand about what the project should be. Now, you need to have the basics of a project, right? If you're going to build a solar project, you got to have adequate sun, you have to have the land that you need, you have to have certain things. But exactly how you structure things, exactly how everything looks at the end of the day, I think tribes fundamentally appreciate the idea of we're going to get there together collaboratively. And if you come to the table with sort of that type of a mindset, then that's the kind of a mindset that will lead you to having a good reputation, but also to having a development that is going to get not only buy-in from whatever the Indigenous people's leadership is, but remember, they all have constituencies too. They have the citizens or members of their community, and they need to get buy-in from those folks as well. So I think part of it, when you have a more an approach that is more malleable, then you ensure that your counterparty has the capability to form the project in a way that will be mutually beneficial and not making presumptions about what that community will want. The other thing I'd say is like, one of the challenges, I think, both for governments and for private corporate entities is that for so long, tribes have not been asked about their views, right? Indigenous peoples have not been asked about their views. They haven't, where there's been consultation, it's been this box checking exercise. And what that does to the Indigenous peoples is that puts them in sort of a defensive posture. And so it can appear like they don't want development. And that's, in my experience, that's just not the case. They want the right kind of development, but it's not that they don't want development. And I think part of the reason people conclude that is because they're in this defensive posture for really understandable reasons. If every time somebody approaches you, it's just to sort of kind of check a box, then you're going to just see that as, okay, well, how am I going to stop this? Because it's, this is inevitably going to come after me whether I like it or not. And so I think that there's really important ways for companies, for governments at various levels to build this level of trust. And again, I keep going back to this, but to me, this is really the key. It's about, if you want to fundamentally change how we're doing this, and when I say how we're doing this is sort of the development of resources in Indian country or indigenous peoples worldwide, I think the key aspect is building a trusting relationship. And that just takes a little bit more time, but it doesn't take that much time. It's about cooperation, it's about understanding each other, understanding what those communities want, and what success for their viewpoint looks like. And I think it's been my experience that if you enter the conversation with that kind of conceptual framework, more often than not, you will have a highly successful project. And that's certainly going to be true in the greening of the economies.
I really appreciate that, and really just your points of bringing up how much that trust is important, and the idea that it almost sounds like maybe some of these checkbox consultations are just asking the wrong questions as well, and
right.
not being willing to hear no, or to hear a different vision for what sustainability might look like.
Right.
Especially if they're not taking the time as people leading consultations to understand what is meaningful and important to someone else that they may not share.
Yeah, exactly. The thing is this is not some kind of new thinking, right? I mean, what is the secret to good diplomacy? Listening. I mean, you talk to any long-term diplomat and they will tell you the most important skill you will learn is listen to your counterparty, because you will understand what they need and how they see it. Now, you may have disagreements at the end of the day. If you're representing country X and country Y is criticizing country X, well, there are some things that are zero-sum. But if you want to be successful in diplomacy, the key aspect of it is to engage in a healthy, respectful way. And I think that if we do that, and if that is the model, whether you're a government or a private party trying to do business with indigenous peoples, you will see the likelihood of success grow significantly. That's been my experience time and again.
Well, thank you. Well, Martin, I want to bring these lessons back to what you're building. Understanding the importance of listening, hearing no, hearing those potentially maybe even frustrating conversations that you all have experienced in your roles of bringing together labor, employers, and governments around issues of people's labor rights. How do you see that? How do you see that collaboration working? What are you most hopeful about in terms of the development of the consultation mechanism that you're building?
I think these are two different things, to create this dialogue at the regional, at the global level. But I think it's because the decisions have to be taken at the national level. But increasingly so also, I think, in a coordinated manner, because there is, not the same standards everywhere. We have a universal declaration. We have, the UN Declaration of Rights of Indigenous Peoples. We have an ILO convention, that is even integrated in the national law when it's ratified, but we see quite some discrepancies, and that means that, we need to do much more work also to make the progress happen everywhere. So what we try at the dialogue mechanism, in dialogue exercises at the global and the regional level at the framework of the ILO is basically to create that appetite and to have those experience of listening and understanding mutual positions, and hope that this will then also, help us to find out what is the lessons learned and how we can promote that and support that at the national level. Clearly speaking, we see that when consultations are done in good faith and genuinely, very often, most of the time they lead to some sort of agreement and consent. Like one example is Colombia. I mean, there is not a very exact statistics, different numbers going around, but the government reports of thousands of consultation processes that, according to them, have led to agreement and consent. And then the issue becomes, are these agreements being honored? And that is the next step of the problem, that once an agreement is there, I think the agreement has obligations for different stakeholders, including government, maybe the private sector, and that is also something that needs to be monitored where it's there. No? On the other hand, we see that in many situations there is still some, legal obstacles. Like particularly when it's in the, in extractive industries. The mining laws of many countries, they imply that when a license or is given to prospect and to explore, that this implies a right to extract. So I think then we have to be very careful about when is the right moment to consult. And this sort of issues. So finally, my last point on this, I think, is the roles between the government and the private sector are not identical. So states have obligations under international law. Companies are also responsible for human rights principles. This might not be exactly the same, but still it's quite coherent and complementary. So this articulation of whose role is what, I think is very important. I think the stronger the position of indigenous peoples is, if it is very clear that where the lands and the relationship between indigenous peoples and the private sector becomes very strong, but in many cases the institutions of indigenous peoples are still developing and need to be strengthened. So in that sense, the role of the state also in protecting the rights of indigenous peoples implies also the responsibility of putting in place appropriate frameworks, including regulatory frameworks. And I think the issue of regulating consultation processes is like a very salient and urgent issue, because in the countries where such regulation exists, there are varying experiences around it. And I think it's time now also to learn from lessons from existing regulation, and how did they fit the needs of indigenous peoples? How do they see it? How do the private sector see it? How does the state, different actors see those? In Chile, for the moment, they are doing an exercise. They have a regulation there. The consultations are for extractive projects are basically within the environmental impact assessment. This is one way of doing it, but they are reviewing that, also hearing indigenous people saying that this is not the best way it works for them, and so they want to go to the next level in regulation. While in other countries we see that the high courts, the constitutional courts, actually strike out existing regulatory instruments, executive orders mostly, saying that the right to consultation needs to be regulated at the statutory law level, because this is a constitutional right, the right to consultation. So there is like the kind of below the statutory law level, there is sort of a risk that these frameworks are being invalidated by the courts. So I think we know that public administration need regulation to assign budgets. There is no administration that can act without a legal basis. But there is also this need to build trust in order to ensure that regulation doesn't restrict rights, but that it furthers actually this idea of co-construction, of cooperation, and that it doesn't, basically lead to a situation where, consultations do not take place in line with international standards. I think there is this discussion that is overdue, and it's very difficult. And I think for that also we hope that we can contribute to bring people together to build trust around these issues, because this is, as I said a bit earlier, we have to catch up a lot, while the train is going even faster, and extractive industry will expand, and is geared to expand because of the need for critical minerals. So this is a very timely conversation we're having here.
You look like you want to jump in.
No. It just, Martin's statement just reminded me that the other component of this is enforcement and remedies, right?
Yeah.
Like these systems, like any system, you build a system not for enforcement and remedies. But without enforcement and remedies, then that system is not credible, because people don't have to follow that system. And so, one of the things that the UN experts have pushed states on, whether through MRIP or the Special Rapporteur or even the Permanent Forum, is to ensure that you have mechanisms to legal relief, so that these concepts are not just sort of voluntary, and if they're not abided by, there's no consequence. And I think that in many places, including in the U.S. In certain instances, we've seen where those systems for accountability are inadequate, and they have not been able to stop projects that clearly have an impact on indigenous territories and resources. So my view is always that we should concentrate a lot on kind of building that trusting relationship. But as part of that, there is a necessary a concomitant to have some kind of consequence for the failure to properly live by these requirements on consent and consultation.
Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I just want to make comments to both comments of that have been offered. One, first, when we talk about, I think it is an improvement that countries are beginning to think about regulations or policies on consultation. One, because it's a recognition that they have to do consultation and consent process. So just on that face, it's great. But I also think that we also have to remember that what the law says, what international law says about consultation and free informed consent with Indigenous peoples is it needs to be through their institutions, through those that they select, and in a way that respects their cultures and norms. As a result, what we're also seeing is that huge numbers of Indigenous peoples, because of the continued approaches that they have from all people of all walks of life who want to engage them for good or for bad, right? They've developed their own decision-making protocols, right? And again, not so foreign. If you're going to engage another government, you're a government, you're going to ask, how do they like to be engaged? How do they make decisions, right? And somewhere at a minimum, while you try to establish the relationship that the ambassador is talking about, you're going to meet in the middle. So I'm excited about the notion that you have a national legislation or a provincial legislation that says this must happen. It does need to have that flexibility, though, and we have seen in the carbon markets, different balances of that. In some cases, it's just here's the consultation plan and here's the timeline, and we'll be swinging by your 3 territories, and there'll be a bus that picks you up on the corner, and you need to be there. In others, they're starting with workshops and capacity building, and the Indigenous peoples are used to the faces that are coming, and it's a different environment. I also want to agree with the ambassador about the issues of remedies. When you're engaged in this relationship and when you're doing consultations, it's not just to get to some benefit sharing agreement that says you get X% of some royalty or whatever, because now you've said, great, we want this, now you've legitimized it. It's about a broader discussion about rights. It's a broader discussion about what's important to you, your people, your vision for economic development, how we could jointly work to protect your lands and better enforce existing laws or create new ones, or even just to get to titling when that titling isn't there, or when the titling's there but there's no protection that's been happening and it's allowed for harm. So I think there's more. And you have to talk about grievance mechanisms. Again, that's nothing new. If you pull up any kind of, agreement on critical minerals, extractives, or anything, the agreement's going to talk about how you resolve your disputes, whether that's with arbitration or sitting in the forest with a bunch of leaders and talking about, reconciling your differences. So needs to have a grievance mechanisms, needs to have remedies that are appropriate, and the remedy can't just be a temporary suspension of a project. It has to be on the table sometimes, just that the project ends. We hope not, right, if it could be resolved. But we have to have a full panoply of remedies because I think also what happens is that Indigenous peoples also find they not only don't have access to that remedy, or they've used that remedy, some kind of national judicial remedies before, and clearly that's not working, which is why you see groups like the Human Rights Committees and other international tribunals receiving so many, right? And the complaint mechanism of financial institutions, they're receiving so many complaints because the domestic ones aren't working. So we need good complaint mechanisms, we need good remedies. Yes, we need benefit sharing, but it's not the only window by which you just talk about rights. And it also doesn't exclude where just compensation might be needed as well, right? As a matter of bargaining and negotiation. So I just drifting off of what all of you have said, I just want to add those.
Yeah.
And just a quick point on that. I think that the other aspect is that often mere compensation is wholly insufficient, right? Like even if you paid more than what the value of a plot of land is worth, right? Indigenous peoples are not like, say, people living in suburban Maryland, where if you destroyed their home, they may be fine to say, okay, well, I'll just go buy another home. This is their lands. These are where they've lived, their ancestors have lived, their people are buried oftentimes. So there's all of these connections to this particular place. And so you must have not only the ability to have compensatory relief, but also relief that allows you to stop the project, do remediation where these agreements have not been fulfilled, and having some kind of juridical tribunals that allow you to effectively enforce those rights. That's another critical component. And when I look at Latin America in particular, for example, I think that's one of the challenges there, and one of the challenges Indigenous peoples have long complained about is that even when they've identified, and everybody agrees that there's been some sort of lack of consultation or violation of rights or violation of an agreement or environmental damage that they were not informed about, whatever the wrong is, that there simply isn't the kind of strengthened domestic institutions in court systems, for example, that allow them to enforce those rights effectively. So that's the other. We often talk about institutional capacity building of Indigenous peoples and their institutions, but there also, in many places, has to be institutional capacity building for the states themselves. And that's another place where I think multilateral organizations can be helpful, such as OHCHR and many others.
Those are such excellent points, and I, just based on my knowledge of things like development finance, I can't imagine that these are adequately resourced at the moment.
No,
that these mechanisms and institutions and capacities are even close to the state that you're describing. And I'm inspired by the list of options you've put on the table for things like remedy. And I'm thinking also about the fact that some of these cases of harm might be things that I heard of just one case where it was a cave that was blown up by a particular mining company that had, they said, 46,000 years of evidence of continuous human inhabitancy of that area, and that's an irreparable harm that can just never be given back again. So I can imagine how, in the face of a situation like that, I don't know if compensation was the thing that was on the table, but that is certainly, I think, in these cases, they're more nuanced than that. And the toolkit, it sounds like the toolkit of remedy and enforcement needs to be much more robust and large than it is now. Martin, I know you wanted to say something as well.
I think it's very fascinating because we see that everything is quite interconnected, and it sees that we need a systemic approach. That's why also I'm always referring to our convention, but it's a bit older than the UN Declaration, but there is some wisdom I think that's still very good. It speaks about coordinated and systematic action of this government to protect the rights of Indigenous people. So it's a whole of government approach, and I think in terms of institutions, traditional approach is that you're going to have that the government agency will be there for tribal peoples or for indigenous peoples because they were seen as backward and needing some protectionist, this was that you had these kind of agencies, but some countries to transform this now into sort of governmental lead agencies. They're supposed to oversee a whole of government approach. I think this is something, maybe it's not there yet, but I think this is where we should be getting. So indigenous peoples need to be included in all sectoral policies, education, employment, and have the participation there, beyond project-related consultations. But we need also an overarching indigenous peoples national policy, that is written together with the indigenous peoples, of course. And when it comes to consultations, we need sort of, because it's the executive branch of the government that is doing a lot. Here we need some nodal agency that is, looking into issues and overseeing consultation processes that are carried out by other parts of the government, but also when that is kind of outsourced to the private sector, which is the case sometimes, then that is properly overseen. And so the experience from Latin America is that, it was not really about whether there was agreement reached or not, but there was the most basic, conditions of doing a serious consultation process, were not there. Too late, no information, pro forma. So that is really where it is, and it's not a question of how rich that country is. This is happening in OECD countries, and in countries that. So it's really, it shows also that structural issue that is ingrained. That ambassador also has mentioned that indigenous peoples were not part of the equation. And now we turn around when it's about critical minerals, and now we plead partnership, and I think we have to show, that this is serious. So in that sense, I think it's a very, very important juncture to move the needle on also the institutions. So that's why a lot of litigation goes up to the constitutional courts, because it's basically a litigation around constitutional rights. And that can take very long. And then in many cases in Latin American high courts and constitutional courts, projects are canceled or suspended because of that right was not respected. And that is not in the interest of anyone, that you have to litigate for years. So you need to have that at every level. When things are going wrong, you need to be able to have a recourse in that. And that is also why you can't regulate everything in a law consultation. You need to have that flexibility. So, for instance, we have been advising, that it's not good to include a 3-month deadline in a law, because you don't know, So there is, there is design questions. There is no one size fits all approach. But honestly speaking, there is very little experience with this across the globe. And again, I think the Americas is far advanced on this issue, and I think we need to draw out the learning so we can promote that also in other parts of the world.
These are excellent points. I would love to hear what either of you have your thoughts on the role of the state and sort of a whole of government approach, perhaps starting with you, Ambassador. What should the U.S. and other governments be doing to have a more comprehensive approach to ensure that they're adequately supporting indigenous rights and just transition? Are there a couple things that you're looking at or you're watching that should be happening? Sure.
Well, one is to have leadership, right? I mean, there's a really important component when the head of state or the heads of agencies make clear what is the right practice, make clear what the expectations are, and themselves be involved in engagement. Now, nobody's Pollyannish to think that the head of state is going to be involved in every project. That's not what I'm saying, but there's a leadership role in that. One of the things President Obama did here in the US, for example, is that he established what was called the Tribal Nations Conference. And so every year there was a conference in Washington, D.C. that he spoke at every year. Most of the cabinet members spoke at that. And it was about an opportunity for tribes and tribal leaders to engage with the senior leadership of an administration and together define across the board on a variety of issues, from healthcare to energy to land use, whatever, environment. What were the priorities? What were the objectives? And the fact that the President of the United States led this annual conference fundamentally shifted the priority on indigenous issues here in the United States, across the board. And you can trace so many adopted positive policies to this one conference. And so I think one thing that is very important is that we can't give short shrift to the idea that leadership can matter. And leadership can matter by states all over the globe. And if a leader of a state, an elected leader says, look, this is a priority, this is important, that has an important effect throughout the institutions of government. But that is a necessary but not sufficient precondition. The other aspect of it is you've got to actually put in writing and also in consultation how you're going to implement these practices to ensure the engagement. What counts as sufficient? And I think you have to get pretty granular in those, because I think that, and then you have to have leaders that say, these are the expectations that we have. And over time, if you've done it right, it builds a sort of muscle memory that allows you to then ensure that you have that relationship developed in a positive direction.
Thank you. And you have any thoughts on that?
No, I mean, obviously I agree with everything the ambassador said. I might just add some additional thoughts, which is, obviously, first, you can simply include more Indigenous peoples in government, and certainly that helps, not just at a local and state level, but also at the national level, really just simply all levels of government, because that's where Indigenous rights and Indigenous interests are going to be discussed. I think the leadership is really important, especially a leadership that actually wants to appeal to donors, and especially if they do that collectively with other governments, appeal to donors to say, we need more money up front. Because sometimes what happens in project development, you have to go through a number of steps before you eventually get, real funding. But in order to assure that approval of projects happens with prior informed consent, if we're talking about a project that's affecting Indigenous peoples' lands, rights, resources, livelihoods, etc., you often need that investment earlier on. So I think all of us have a responsibility, but certainly governments need to prioritize that. And I know I've said it before, but just simply need to prioritize that as a budget request. If you want this done well, if you want to avoid grievances in the future, if you want to avoid having to call us up later because a harm has happened, we need to include all of the stakeholders. I'd also say that governments need to harmonize their laws, because you can't, on so many occasions, as I'm sure my co-panelists have seen, you can have one part of the government saying, it's wonderful, we just demarcated and titled this land, and per this legislation, and then there's another piece of legislation that allows for various exceptions that provide for, unchecked incursions into the land that actually do damage. And somehow there has to be a coherency in all of that. And lastly, and this may seem, I really think governments need to prioritize, one, inclusive participation and transparency in their monitoring and reporting. Indigenous peoples and other stakeholders need to be involved in who's monitoring these impacts and reporting them. And then how to pivot and sort of, I'm not talking about remedies, but just pivoting when you see a problem, right, and addressing it. And I think also what comes into play, the other thing I think is governments sometimes are a little too laxed in a requirement, which is the social environmental assessment, which needs to be the basis in many cases for some kind of a project to be approved, and for some nationally, but also to be approved really with Indigenous peoples. And I think sometimes these social environmental assessments, I hope that governments will be even more diligent in the future about who they select to do these assessments. And also what we're seeing, whether that's in carbon markets or in other forestry protections and just energy transitions, is sometimes these social environmental assessments that are done, they almost read like a desk review. that says, oh yes, they have an access to information law, check. Yes, they have a law that is to title indigenous people's lands, check, right? They have an anti-corruption law, check, but nobody bothers to go on the ground or frankly just spend 2 hours on the computer and find out if there's any grievances about the implementations of these laws before the Human Rights Committee or the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights. It doesn't, so in other words, it's the qualitative assessment that needs to also inform all of these projects. And I think that's driven by what the government expects, in these assessments and then requires of their contractors and private sectors will come in. So it's sort of an odd thing, but so important.
Thank you so much. I mean, I'm going to attempt to sum up some of the themes we've heard today, and then I'll turn to each of you just for your closing word. And I will do something which may be infuriating for any person that is an advocate of people's rights to ask you to do this, but I will ask you if you could just say, in your closing, why is this so critical? Why do we want a just transition where Indigenous rights are respected? Why does it matter? I know it's infuriating because being asked to justify that, I know, can be tantamount to justifying why the rights exist. But because unfortunately, I think in our conversations there can be a narrative that I think is a false narrative, but a narrative that these things are in tension, that the future has to compromise one or the other. So I will ask that. But my attempt to sum up is that I've heard that this is not new. Consultation, FPIC, this can be done, this has been done. These are things that the actors and entities that are doing consultations have the skill sets to be able to do. They have to listen to parties and build those trusting relationships. They have to use tailored, flexible approaches and qualitative information to ensure that they're actually appropriate to each specific context, not just the national. That national consultative mechanisms must be well thought out and involve the right people, but that's not the only level that needs dialogue. That, of course, showing leadership is absolutely essential in creating a ripple effect, and that regulation changes are moving in a positive direction, but there needs to be more harmonization of laws, and that remedy enforcement and enforcement are unfortunately necessary, but what is needed to ensure it a process of integrity. So we've said so many more things today, but that's just my small summary of some of the things that I heard. But I will turn to each of you for a closing thought, and if you don't mind indulging my question, I do want our audience to end with an understanding of why is this so critically important? So I'll start on the screen with Martin, and then I'll go to Vanessa, and I'll end with you, Ambassador.
Thank you so much. I think this already, the three of us here, or the four of us, we come from quite different perspective and backgrounds, and we're not necessarily, working with the same groups but I think already here we see there is, despite what we see often as contradictions, there is a lot of common interest and a lot of energy. And I think this is something that really shows that this is the right way to go forward to tackle some of the fundamental challenges that we have as humanity, frankly speaking. So I think this is not really voluntary. This is absolutely critical, for moving forward as humanity and as a society that cares for values and for protecting people and the planet. So this is my rights is part of that. It cannot be eclipsed.
Thank you, Vanessa.
Well, I think that it's important simply because we're constantly hearing about the climate urgency. We're constantly hearing about national security concerns around energy, right? Everybody's saying it's pressing, But the only way to address those is, I think, through Indigenous peoples and their inclusiveness. That's where we're going to get the success of an energy transition in so many places throughout the global geography. And nobody knows climate change, the impacts and adverse impacts, nor security and the impacts on security as Indigenous peoples. They've been at the forefronts. They have a lot to teach us, and they want to be involved. Yes, sometimes they're going to say no. And when they say no, we're going to have to accept that, right? But sometimes they're going to say yes. They actually want to be engaged, as the ambassador said. I've met few Indigenous peoples who want to, right? Those are voluntary, isolated people. Most want to engage in some way in the energy transition. Just recently in Peru, 3 Indigenous groups actually submitted their first jurisdictional Indigenous carbon initiative. They're going to be looking for technical support and buyers. They need buyers. In Argentina, I know in indigenous peoples who have title to land, they have knowledge of solar energy and installing solar. They want to do a solar station, and the nearby province wants to buy that energy from them. They need a progressive company to go down and talk to them. In Brazil, there's an indigenous people that crosses 3 Amazon states. They've just decided they want to develop their own carbon project. They need technical assistance. So it's important because indigenous peoples are on the playing field, and when you have an open player, you're going to kick the ball to them or throw the ball, whatever football you play, right? They're open and they're looking for the pass or the kick, and we need to be there. And that's the way we have a successful energy transition, I believe.
Thank you, Ambassador.
Well, I think my two colleagues on this panel have given some great answers, but I would add this. Look, we have to deal with the climate crisis. The international community has agreed on that. A significant amount of the things necessary for that are on indigenous lands. So you then have a choice. You need to get some of those resources somehow. Do you do it in a way that's cooperative? Do you do it in the way that's going to build relationships? Do you do it in the way that's going to raise all boats? Or do you do it in a way that's uncooperative, leads to crisis, leads to fights, leads to insecurity, not only for the indigenous peoples, but for others? And so to me, when you ask it that way, when you say this is a climate imperative, we've got to deal with this, as a necessary part of that, we need to have, figure out how to mine these minerals. Then the only choice is, do we do it the easy way, even though it's not simple? Or do we do it the hard crisis way, conflict way? And to me, when you ask it that way, it is the answer is self-evident. So I would just say, look, I think what we're talking about here, which is a cooperative approach to the greening economy with indigenous peoples, is ultimately, for the reasons I've just articulated, the smart thing to do, and it's also the right thing to do.
With that, I will close. I want to thank everyone so much for tuning in today. Thank you for joining us at the Center for Strategic International Studies for this privileged dialogue. I also want to thank the International Labor Organization for their generous support that made this event possible today, and of course all the supporters of our Human Rights Initiative here at CSIS. So thank you again to my distinguished guests, and thank you for joining us so late in Geneva. I should have said that at the beginning.
Absolutely.
We hope that you will join future events, and it's my pleasure to close this out. Thank you.
Thank you.